All stories are dramatized recreations. Named locations are fictionalized. Any resemblance to real persons is coincidental.
Hi, I'm Emma, a 35-year-old nurse from California. Sharing this is hard, but I need to process how my husband Mark's affair with a female coworker shattered our 10-year marriage. It began when the rhythm of our lives, a rhythm I thought was set to the same steady metronome, developed a faint, almost imperceptible skip. It wasn't a dramatic crash or a discovered text filled with illicit promises. Those came later. It was the quiet things. The new, private smile that would flicker across his face when he thought I wasn't looking, a smile that had nothing to do with me. It was the way his phone, which used to lie discarded on the coffee charger like a forgotten toy, suddenly became a permanent, screened-down extension of his hand. He called it work stress, the natural fatigue of a decade together, and I, the ever-dutiful nurse, diagnosed our relationship with the same common ailments. I prescribed more date nights, more thoughtful gestures, more space. I was treating the symptoms while the disease, the silent, creeping betrayal, was metastasizing just beneath the surface of our seemingly ordinary life. The real beginning was a Tuesday. It's always a Tuesday, isn't it? The most mundane of days. I had just finished a double shift, the kind that leaves your feet aching and your soul feeling thin, stretched taut by the constant demands of others. The house was dark and still, which was wrong. Mark's car was in the driveway, but he wasn't in the living room, wasn't in the kitchen making the late-night snack he always did. I found him in his small home office, asleep at his desk, his head cradled in his arms. He looked peaceful, younger. A wave of affection washed over me, tinged with the guilt of my recent suspicions. This was my husband, the man I'd built a life with. I was being paranoid. I went to wake him gently, to suggest we both go to bed. That's when I saw it. His laptop was still on, its screen glowing in the dark room. A messaging app was open, not the one we used for family, but another one. A single unsent message was sitting in the text box. It was addressed to Sarah from accounting. The message itself was just a line of 3 emojis, a cup of coffee, a winking face, a heart. My own heart didn't break then, it simply stopped. It froze solid in my chest, a block of ice. A cup of coffee, he'd told me he was working through lunch. A winking face, the same wink he'd given me this morning over his cereal, a wink I'd thought was for me. A heart he claimed was too tired to be romantic anymore. I didn't wake him. I backed out of the room as if I'd stumbled upon a sleeping predator, my breath held tight in my lungs. In the hallway, I leaned against the wall, the cool plaster a shock against my back. The details, the tiny symptoms I'd ignored, came rushing in, not as isolated incidents, but as a confirmed diagnosis. The new cologne. The sudden interest in going to the gym after work. The way he'd started listening to a new podcast she'd apparently recommended. The quick after-work drinks with the teams that had become a weekly fixture. It was all so cliché, so painfully predictable, that I felt a surge of nausea not just at his betrayal, but at its utter lack of originality. He had torn apart our marriage for a story I felt like I'd already read 100 times. The next few days were a blur of silent observation. I became a ghost in my own home, a researcher studying the collapse of her own life. I'd watch him talk about his day, his voice so normal, so familiar, and I'd wonder how many of those words were lies. I'd look at our wedding photo on the mantle, my smile so wide and trusting, his arms so possessive around my waist, and the image would seem like an artifact from a museum, a depiction of a people who no longer existed. The confrontation was inevitable, but it wasn't a screaming match. It was quieter, deadlier. I asked him about Sarah from accounting on a Sunday morning. The sun was streaming through the kitchen windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I was making coffee, and the question came out as casually as I could manage, my back to him. The silence that followed was louder than any yell. It was a void that swallowed the entire room. When I finally turned around, the look on his face, a messy combination of guilt, panic, and defiance, told me everything. The excuses came then, a torrent of them. It didn't mean anything. It was just a bit of fun. It was the stress at work. I made him feel inadequate. He was sorry, so sorry. Each word was not an apology but another brick being laid in the wall between us. I didn't cry. I just listened, my hand still wrapped around the warm mug, and I realized the man standing in front of me was a stranger. The husband I knew was gone, and in his place was someone who could look me in the eye and dismantle our world with a series of emojis. That was the true beginning of the end. Not the discovery, but the moment I realized the past 10 years were a story I had only half read, and the ending was going to be written in someone else's handwriting. The discovery didn't happen in a dramatic confrontation or through a hacked phone. It happened at a company summer picnic, surrounded by the smell of charcoal and the sound of forced laughter. Mark's firm rented out a section of a park, all green grass and sunny skies, a perfect backdrop for a lie. I was wearing a new sundress, the kind you buy when you're trying to remind yourself and your husband that you're still a woman, not just a wife, not just a nurse. He'd kissed me on the cheek that morning and told me I looked nice, but his eyes were already elsewhere, already at the picnic, already with her. I should have known then. The first hour was a blur of handshakes and small talk with people whose names I could never remember. Mark was the perfect host, my arm tucked in his, playing the part of the doting, successful husband. And then I saw her, Sarah from accounting. She was exactly as I'd imagined. Younger, with an easy laugh that carried across the lawn. She was playing cornhole and Mark's eyes kept drifting toward her, pulled by some invisible string. My stomach tightened, but I told myself I was being ridiculous. Paranoid. This was a work function, of course he'd look at his colleagues. The moment the glitch came because of a hot dog. Someone's golden retriever, a friendly, slobbering beast named Buddy, had been weaving through the crowd, begging for scraps. Sarah was cooing over him, scratching behind his ears. "Oh, he's so sweet. What's his name?" she asked the group at large. Mark, from where he stood beside me, grilling burgers, answered without looking up. "That's Baxter," he said, his voice casual, automatic, and the world went silent. The laughter, the music, the sizzle of the grillet, all just drained away. Because the dog's name was Buddy. I knew it was Buddy. His owner, Dave from logistics, had been shouting it all afternoon. But Mark had called him Baxter. Baxter was the name of our old golden retriever, the dog we'd had to put down 3 years ago. A name from our intimate, shared history. A name that had no business here, in this park, with these people. He'd used the wrong name for the dog. He'd looked at Sarah, and a piece of our private world had just slipped out. It was a tiny, stupid thing. A meaningless error to anyone else. But to me, it was a crack in the foundation of everything. It was the first tangible proof that his mind was in two places at once, that the barrier between his life with me and his life with her was porous, leaking. I must have made a sound, a small, choked gasp, because Mark finally turned to look at me. His smile was still in place, but it was fraying at the edges. "You okay, Em?" he asked, his voice laced with a concern that now sounded rehearsed. I could only nod, my throat too tight for words. I looked from him to Sarah, who was now laughing at something another man had said, completely oblivious to the earthquake she had just caused. She hadn't even heard him. The secret message, the intimate slip, was for me alone. It was my burden to carry. The rest of the picnic passed in a nightmarish haze. I watched them now, my observations sharpened to a clinical point. I saw the way he angled his body toward her in a group conversation, the way he offered her a burger from the grill first, the one he'd saved just for her because he knew she didn't like onions, a detail he knew. I saw the way their fingers brushed when he handed her a napkin, a touch that lasted a fraction of a second too long. Each moment was a data point, building an unassailable case against him. The coffee emojis on his screen had been a suspicion. This public, intimate carelessness was a conviction. I spent the next 2 hours performing the greatest acting role of my life. I smiled. I chatted with the other spouses. I handed out paper plates and praised the potato salad. I was the perfect, polished extension of him, all while my insides were turning to glass, fracturing into a million sharp pieces. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw my lemonade in his face and point to Sarah and demand to know just how long he had been feeding her pieces of our life, pieces of me. But I didn't. I held it all in, the perfect nurse, stabilizing the patient while ignoring my own catastrophic internal bleeding. On the car ride home, he tried to make conversation. "That was fun, huh? The team really seems to be gelling." I just stared out the window at the passing streets, the familiar landmarks of our life together now looking alien and hostile. Yeah, I said, my voice flat and distant. Fun. He didn't press. He probably thought I was tired. He had no idea he was driving a hearse, carrying the corpse of our marriage back to the house where it would be buried. That night, lying in bed beside him, the space between us felt like a chasm. I listened to his even, sleeping breaths and replayed the moment over and over. Baxter. The name echoed in the dark, a ghost he had summoned. It was such a small thing, so silly and insignificant. But that was the cruelty of it. It wasn't a grand betrayal you could rage against, it was a paper cut, a tiny, precise slice that went deeper than any blade could. It was the knowledge that his mind, his heart, his memories, the very currency of our life together were no longer exclusively mine. They were being shared, diluted, given away to a woman who played cornhole at a company picnic. The trust wasn't just broken, it was revealed to have been an illusion all along. And I was left alone in the dark, cradling the weight of a truth he didn't know I possessed, the first and only victim of a crime he hadn't even realized he'd committed. The days after the picnic were an exercise in existing as a ghost in my own home. I moved through the rooms with a detached clinical precision, my nurse's training kicking in to assess a patient that was already dead. I just hadn't pronounced it yet. Every object, every routine, every harmless habit was now evidence to be examined under the cold, bright light of my new reality. The autopsy of our ordinary life had begun, and I was both the pathologist and the corpse. I started noticing the architecture of his lies, the careful scaffolding that held up his double life. The gym bag he took with him every evening, I finally looked inside. It didn't contain sweaty clothes. It held a fresh shirt, a different cologne, a toothbrush, a go bag for an affair. He wasn't going to the gym, he was showering there after being with her. The realization was a cold knife twisting in my gut. I'd actually praised him for his new dedication to fitness. I began, accidentally, burning his old things on the grill. It started with the hideous novelty tie she'd apparently given the whole department for Secret Santa. He'd worn it once with a smirk, and I'd teased him about it. Now, watching the polyester melt and blacken in the blue flame, I felt a grim, vicious satisfaction. The next night, it was the book she'd recommended, the one he'd left on his nightstand. The pages curled and turned to ash, the words he'd read on her recommendation disappearing into smoke. It wasn't about destroying his property, it was about purging her presence from our space, from our history. I was reclaiming the territory, inch by incinerated inch. He didn't notice a thing. He was too busy texting her, his thumbs flying across the screen, that same private smile playing on his lips. He'd tell me it was work stuff, and I'd just nod, my eyes fixed on the flames, my soul screaming into a void he couldn't hear. The nights were the worst. He'd fall asleep easily, his conscience clear, while I lay rigid beside him, my mind a frantic, buzzing hive of pain. I'd slip out of bed and wander the house like a specter. I found myself having intense, whispered conversations with my own reflection in the dark, blank screen of the microwave, in the toaster, in the kitchen window. "Who are you now?" my reflection would ask, its features distorted and pale. "What's left of you?" I had no answers. I was a shell, a woman whose entire identity had been built on the foundation of a lie. The wife, the partner, the homemaker, it all felt like a costume I'd been wearing for a play that had abruptly closed. At 3 a.m., driven by a restless, manic energy I didn't recognize, I pulled my old laptop from a closet. I hadn't danced since college, but I found myself searching for beginner breakdancing tutorials on YouTube. In the silent, dim living room, with the furniture pushed back, I tried to mimic the moves, my body stiff and uncooperative. It was absurd. A 35-year-old nurse in her pajamas attempting windmills on the rug at 3 in the morning. But the physical failure was a welcome distraction from the emotional collapse. The pain of a bruised hip was concrete, manageable. It was a feeling I could understand, a hurt I could locate and treat. I became a collector of data, a spy in my own war. I noted the times he'd leave for work early. I mapped the patterns of his text notifications. I learned the specific way his voice would change when he was on the phone with her. Lighter, higher, more attentive. It was a voice he hadn't used with me in years. I was disassembling our life, bolt by bolt, and each piece I removed revealed another layer of the deception. The man I loved was a carefully constructed fiction, and I was finally reading the fine print. The love notes I'd saved in a box on my dresser felt like artifacts from another woman's life. The future we planned, the trip to Italy, the dream of converting the guest room into a nursery, now felt like a cruel joke. I was living in the ruins of a future that would never happen, and the silence of the house was the sound of its implosion. I was no longer his wife. I was his archivist, his biographer, chronicling the death of us with a quiet, devastating accuracy. And he, oblivious, just kept writing the next chapter with her, never noticing that I had already closed the book. The world outside had become a blur of color and noise, but inside the hospital, everything was sharp, sterile, and brutally logical. It was my sanctuary and my torture chamber. Here, I was Nurse Emma, competent, calm, and in control. Here, my own heartbreak was not a relevant vital sign. I could lose myself in the rhythm of beeping monitors, the scent of antiseptic, the precise language of symptoms and treatments. My own pain was a private tumor I could ignore for 12 hours at a time. I volunteered for every double shift, every extra hour. The exhausted, aching physicality of the work was a penance I welcomed. It was easier to focus on the tangible pain of others than to sit with the formless, suffocating agony of my own. I'd come home so drained I could barely shower before collapsing into a dreamless sleep, a small mercy that kept the thoughts at bay. Mark barely noticed my absence. My schedule provided the perfect cover for his own. Then came Mrs. Gable in room 304, congestive heart failure. A sweet, elderly woman with paper-thin skin and a locket that held a picture of her late husband, Henry. They'd been married for 52 years. Her children visited often, their faces etched with a worry that was born from love, not suspicion. They'd hold her hand and tell stories about Henry, and Mrs. Gable's eyes, though clouded with illness, would sparkle with the memory of a love that had lasted. It was a love that was real, documented, and witnessed. It was everything I thought I had. Caring for her was a special kind of torture. Every time I adjusted her oxygen, every time I checked the edema in her ankles, I was confronted with the evidence of the enduring partnership. It was in the way she spoke of him, not with the dramatic flair of a story often told, but with the quiet, ingrained certainty of a shared life, a life that had endured. One Tuesday afternoon, her condition deteriorated rapidly. The calm, rhythmic beeping of her heart monitor erupted into the frantic, flatlining shriek of a code blue. The room instantly flooded with people, doctors, respiratory therapists, other nurses. The air crackled with controlled urgency. I was at her side, my hands performing compressions, my voice reciting numbers and medications on autopilot. My mind was a checklist, a series of steps to cheat death. But beneath the professional veneer, a silent, screaming parallel was running. As I pushed on her fragile sternum, I thought, this is me. This is my marriage. We are coding right now. My arms burned with the effort of trying to restart a heart that had simply decided it was done. A doctor called for the crash cart, his voice sharp and clear, and I thought of the picnic, the dog, the emojis, the moments that had flatlined my own life. We worked on her for 20 minutes. 20 minutes of pounding and pumping and injecting, a violent, desperate attempt to force a heart to feel again. But it was no use, she was gone. The doctor called it time of death, 3017 p.m. The team slowly filtered out, the adrenaline fading, leaving behind the heavy, solemn silence of failure. I was left alone in the room to begin the necessary, sacred duties of the after. As I gently wiped her face and prepared her for her family, my tears finally came. They weren't just for Mrs. Gable. They were for Henry, who had waited for her for so long. They were for the locket that would now be passed to a grieving daughter. And they were for me. For the death of my own future, for the love I thought would last 50 years but hadn't even made it to 15. I cried for the version of me that believed in forever, the one who had died in this room alongside a woman she barely knew. I finished my tasks, my hands steady even as my shoulders shook with silent sobs. I drew the sheet over her head, a final, awful gesture. Leaving the room felt like walking away from my own funeral. The hallway was bright, buzzing with the mundane activity of a hospital that never stops. Life went on, but I was different. The code blue had failed. You can't restart a heart that doesn't want to beat. Standing there, surrounded by life and death, I had the most terrifyingly clear thought of my life. I had to stop trying to resuscitate something that was already gone. I had to stop performing CPA on my marriage. The compressions, the desperate breaths, the date nights, the grilled dinners, the new dresses. It was all just a prolonged code, blue on a relationship that had already been declared dead. Mrs. Gable's heart had stopped, but it had known a lifetime of love. Mine was still beating, but it was trapped in a chamber of lies. It was time to stop trying to save us. It was time to save myself. The silence in the house after Mark finally left was a physical presence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a sleeping household. It was a hollow, echoing void that seemed to swallow all sound and light. He'd packed his bags with a quiet, shame-faced efficiency, his apologies sounding tinny and meaningless in the vast space of our broken trust. The door clicked shut behind him, and I stood in the center of the living room, utterly alone. The weight of it should have crushed me. I waited for the tsunami of grief to finally break, for the sobs I'd been holding back for weeks to rack my body. But it didn't come. Instead, a strange, unnerving calm settled over me. The chaos had ended. The patient was gone. Now, it was just me and the aftermath. The silence wasn't an enemy, it was a blank slate. And for the first time in months, the only heartbeats in the room were my own. I couldn't bear to look at the remnants of our life together. The wedding photos on the mantle, the vacation souvenirs, the matching coffee mugs, they were all artifacts from a civilization that had collapsed. I didn't want to burn them in anger anymore. I didn't want to box them up and hide them in the attic like a shameful secret. I needed to transform them, to alchemize the pain into something new. I'd always been fascinated by kintsugi, the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with gold lacquer, embracing the flaws and fractures as part of the object's history. The philosophy always struck me as beautiful, but I'd never understood it on a visceral level until now. We are not broken things to be discarded. We are broken things to be mended, with our scars made visible and beautiful. The garage became my sanctuary. I dragged every broken piece of our life out there, a chipped vase we'd bought on our honeymoon, a plate we'd received as a wedding gift that had cracked in half, the mug with the stupid inside joke that now felt like a lie. I went to a craft store and bought plaster, gold leaf, and epoxy. I didn't know what I was doing. My first attempts were messy, clumsy. The gold epoxy smeared where it shouldn't. My joins were uneven. But I didn't care. The physical act of taking something shattered and patiently, meticulously, putting it back together was a meditation. With every piece I mended, I felt a tiny, fractured part of myself click back into place. I wasn't ignoring the break. I was tracing its path with gold. I was acknowledging the damage and choosing to make it part of my story, not the end of it. Word of my strange new hobby got out. A friend from the hospital, seeing a picture of a mended bowl I posted online, asked if I could fix a cherished figurine her toddler had broken. Then another friend asked about a plate. Then a coworker. I started taking commissions, not for the money, but for the purpose. My garage studio, once a place for storing the detritus of a failed marriage, became a workshop of resurrection. I called it Kintsugi Care. It was a small business, barely breaking even, but it was mine. It was something I had built from the rubble, with my own two hands. I wasn't just fixing pottery. I was holding space for other people's broken things, for their own small tragedies. I was bearing witness to their fractures and helping them see the beauty in the repair. The day the first check cleared from a complete stranger who had found me online, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. I drove to the nursery and didn't buy a delicate flowering plant. I bought a cactus, a resilient, stubborn, unkillable thing that thrived on neglect and sun. I put it on the kitchen windowsill, right where Mark's coffee maker used to be. It was a small act, but it was a declaration. This house was no longer a museum of our past. It was being remade, room by room, into a home for the woman I was becoming. A woman who was no longer a wife, not yet sure what she was, but who was learning, stitch by golden stitch, how to hold her own pieces together. The silence was no longer hollow. It was filled with the quiet, focused sound of my own breathing and the promise of a future I was building for myself, one broken piece at a time. The universe doesn't send a billboard when it decides your life needs a course correction. It sends a flat tire on a dusty road in the middle of nowhere. Of all the days for my 10-year-old sedan to give up the ghost, it had to be today. I was driving back from a farmer's market in the next county over, My passenger seat filled with lumpy, oddly shaped potatoes I'd bought for a still life painting idea I'd had. The idea itself was a symptom of my new life, a weird, solitary whim I could now indulge simply because I felt like it. The loud, disconcerting thump 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 was a brutal return to reality. I pulled over onto the gravel shoulder, the car listing sadly to one side. No other cars, just fields of sun-scorched grass and the relentless hum of cicadas. Perfect. I got out, the heat rising from the asphalt in visible waves. I stared at the obviously flat rear tire. I had a phone? This was a solvable problem. But in that moment, under the vast, indifferent blue sky, it felt like the final, mocking straw. A tear of pure frustration welled up. I was doing everything right. I was healing. I was building my little business. I was buying weird potatoes for art projects. Why did I still have to deal with flat tires? I kicked the offending tire, immediately regretted it, and hopped on one foot, swearing under my breath. This was the universe's idea of a meet cute? It felt less like romance and more like a stress test. I was fumbling with my phone, trying to get a signal to call for help, when a beat-up pickup truck, the color of faded rust, rumbled to a stop behind me. My grip on the phone tightened, every city dweller's cautionary tale flashing through my mind. The door creaked open and a man got out. He wasn't tall or strikingly handsome in a conventional way. He was solid. Worn jeans, boots that had seen actual work, and a faded t-shirt for a band I'd never heard of. His face was kind, lined from the sun, and he held his hands up in a universal gesture of non-threatening intent. "Looks like you've got a situation," he said, his voice a low, calm rumble that somehow cut through the buzzing anxiety in my head. "I have I said, my voice coming out sharper than I intended, a defensive reflex. "I just can't get a signal." "Well, ma'am," he said, a faint smile touching his eyes, "out here, AA is gonna take about 2 hours. I've got a jack and a decent spare in the back. Could have you back on the road in 20 minutes if you're comfortable with that." "Ma'am." He'd called me ma'am. It was so oddly formal and respectful. Mark would have launched into a lecture about tire pressure, or my choice of vehicle. This man was just offering a solution, no strings, no judgment. I hesitated for a second longer, then my practical nurse's brain took over. A 2-hour wait in this heat versus 20 minutes. The math was simple. Yes, thank you, that would be amazing, I said, the tension in my shoulders easing slightly. His name was Ben. He was a veterinarian who ran a small animal sanctuary a few miles down the road, specializing in rehabilitating neglected farm animals. As he worked with a quiet, efficient competence, he told me about a pygmy goat with anxiety named Kevin who followed him everywhere. He didn't ask me prying questions. He just talked, his voice a steady, calming narration to the rhythmic sound of the jack and the wrench. He saw my box of lumpy potatoes and, without missing a beat, said, "Great choice. Kennebecs. Best for mashing. Worst for still life paintings, they roll right off the table." And he grinned, a real, unguarded grin that reached his eyes. I found myself laughing, a real laugh that felt foreign and wonderful in my chest. He wasn't trying to impress me. He was just being, he finished, wiping his hands on a rag. "You're all set. Get that replaced soon, though," I offered to pay him. He shook his head. "Just do me a favor. Next time you're out this way, stop by and say hi to Kevin. He's a good listener." He handed me a slightly bent business card for his sanctuary. Then he got in his truck, gave a small wave, and drove off. I stood there for a long moment, the repaired car humming beside me, the business card in my hand. The interaction had been so simple, so devoid of subtext or agenda. There was no hidden meaning, no second layer to decode. He'd helped me because he could. He'd made a joke about my potatoes. He'd talked about an anxious goat. It was the most straightforward, honest conversation I'd had with a man in years. It wasn't a lightning bolt. It was a single, clear note of music heard after a long period of deafening silence. I got back in my car, my hands steady on the wheel. The road ahead was the same, but something had subtly, irrevocably shifted. The universe hadn't sent a billboard. It had sent a flat tire, a kind stranger, and the possibility that not all conversations had to be a minefield. For the first time since the picnic, I felt a flicker of something that wasn't pain, anger, or grief. It was curiosity. A week passed. The business card for Sunrise Sanctuary sat on my kitchen counter, propped against the cactus. It became a fixed point in my periphery, a quiet question mark in my new, carefully ordered existence. I'd pick it up, feel the slightly rough texture of the cardstock, put it down, stop by and say hi to Kevin. It sounded so simple, so benign. But for me, it felt like standing on the edge of a high dive. An interaction with a man, a stranger, that wasn't born from necessity or shrouded in the baggage of betrayal. It was a choice, and I wasn't sure I remembered how to make those anymore. My world had been reduced to a binary, Mark, the betrayer, and all other men, who were now potential threats. Ben existed in a nebulous, third category, the kind stranger. But going to see him felt like willingly stepping back into a game whose rules I no longer trusted. I decided to go on a Tuesday. It felt less significant than a weekend. I told myself I was just being polite, following up on a favor. I drove the same road where my tire had blown, the fields just as golden, the sky just as vast. The sanctuary was down a long, unpaved driveway, marked by a hand-painted sign with a slightly lopsided sun rising over silhouettes of animals. It was charmingly unpretentious. I pulled up next to his rusty truck and got out. The air smelled of hay, earth, and a not unpleasant hint of animal. Before I could even reach the front porch of the small farmhouse, I heard a commotion. Ben emerged from a low-slung barn, not with a majestic horse or a cute lamb, but with a very angry-looking large white goose hissing and flapping its wings at his heels. He was trying to shoo it away with a feed bucket, a look of exasperated amusement on his face. "Not now, Lucille. I told you, the corn is for the chickens. You've had your share," he was saying to the goose, as if it could understand him. He looked up and saw me, and his face broke into that same easy grin, completely unbothered by the fact that he was being accosted by poultry. "Ah, you came. Perfect timing. Lee, you can be my witness. Lucille here is attempting a daylight robbery." I couldn't help but laugh. The surreality of it all. The beautiful drive, the serene sanctuary, and this man having a full-blown argument with a goose shattered the last of my nerves. This wasn't a date. This was life. Messy, absurd, and wonderfully undramatic. Just then, a small, shaggy pygmy goat trotted around the corner and butted its head gently against Ben's leg. "And this," Ben said, scratching behind the goat's ears, "is the infamous Kevin. The anxious one. He's a terrible security system, but a great friend." I spent the afternoon there. He gave me a tour, introducing me to every animal by name and sharing their backstories. The three-legged sheep, the blind pony, the pig who was afraid of mud. He wasn't performing. He wasn't trying to impress me with his compassion. This was just his life, and he was letting me peek into it. There was no subtext, no hidden meaning. He was exactly what he appeared to be, a man who loved broken things and dedicated his life to helping them feel whole again. The parallel was not lost on me. We ended up sitting on the porch steps as the sun began to dip lower, sharing a thermos of lemonade. Kevin the goat lay at our feet, chewing contentedly. The conversation was easy, meandering from animal care to our favorite terrible movies. And then, it happened. The moment that would have been a red flag with anyone else, but with him, was a beacon. We were talking about comfort films, the ones you put on when you're sick or sad. I mentioned mine was a obscure, critically panned 80s fantasy movie called The Labyrinth of Lost Dreams. It was a relic from my childhood, full of terrible puppetry and overwrought dialogue. Ben's eyes lit up. "No way," he said, a genuine excitement in his voice. "You're kidding me. The Labyrinth? With the singing mushroom and the knight who's afraid of his own shadow? You've seen it?" I asked, stunned. No one had ever known that movie. "Seen it?" he laughed. "I can recite the whole thing. My sisters and I wore out the VHS tape." And then, without a hint of embarrassment, he launched into a monologue from the film. It was The Knight's Lament, a truly awful, melodramatic speech about honor and cheese. He did the voices. He didn't just remember the lines, he remembered the cadence, the terrible inflections. He committed to it fully, his hands gesturing dramatically, his face a mask of theatrical woe. And he wasn't doing it to mock the film. He was doing it because he genuinely loved it. He wasn't afraid to be silly, to be uncool, to show a piece of his childhood heart without any armor. He finished, slightly out of breath, and looked at me with a sheepish grin. Sorry, it's a party trick that usually clears a room. I was speechless. Mark would have rolled his eyes. He would have called it a guilty pleasure, something to be enjoyed ironically, in secret. Ben wore his love for this terrible movie like a badge of honor. It was a green flag so bright it was almost blinding. It wasn't about the movie. It was about the vulnerability, the utter lack of pretense, the willingness to be fully, completely himself, without curation or filter. In that moment, on a dusty porch surrounded by rescued animals, watching a grown man passionately recite lines from a terrible movie, I felt something I thought I'd forgotten: safety. I didn't have to decode him. I didn't have to look for hidden meanings or lies. He was right there, in the open, heart on his sleeve, surrounded by his chaotic, beautiful, honest life. And for the first time in a very long time, I wanted to step into the frame. The drive to the sanctuary became a Tuesday ritual. It wasn't a formal arrangement. It was simply the day that worked. My week began to subtly reorient itself around that afternoon, the other days feeling like a preamble. I told myself I was going for the animals, for the peace, for the escape from my own four walls. And that was partly true. But it was also for him, for the uncomplicated way he existed. Each visit was another piece of data, another point on a graph that was steadily, undeniably trending upward. I was observing him with the same clinical detachment I'd once used to diagnose my marriage's decay, but this time, the diagnosis was one of startling health. I learned that his quirk wasn't just a party trick or a single endearing trait. It was a consistency of character that was so foreign to me it felt like a new language. He cried at commercials. Not just the sad ones about abandoned animals, though those destroyed him. I was there one evening when a particularly saccharine ad for a chain of hardware stores came on. It featured a father teaching his young daughter how to build a birdhouse. It was cheesy, manipulative, and set to a swelling orchestral score. I was about to make a joke about it when I glanced at Ben. He was sitting on the floor, leaning against the couch, absently stroking Kevin's head. And a single, clear tear was tracing a path down his cheek. He saw me looking and didn't flinch, didn't wipe it away angrily. He just gave a soft, slightly embarrassed shrug. "Gets me every time," he said, his voice a little thick. "The way she looks at him. Like he's showing her the secrets of the universe. It's just a birdhouse, but it's everything, you know? I didn't know." Oh, I had never known a man who could access that kind of emotion so freely, without shame or the need to perform it for effect. Mark's emotions were always transactional, used to elicit a specific response from me: guilt, sympathy, reassurance. Ben's emotions were just his. They happened, like weather, and he let them pass through him without judgment. He owned them. It was the most vulnerable and powerful thing I had ever seen. His compassion wasn't reserved for the camera or for me. It was for everything. I watched him spend 40 minutes on the phone with an elderly woman who'd found a baby squirrel in her garden, patiently talking her through how to keep it warm until a wildlife carer could arrive. He didn't rush her. He didn't make her feel foolish for caring. He ended the call with, "You're doing great, ma'am. Thank you for being so kind to him." He'd hang up and then immediately curse with creative vigor at a broken fence post, his tenderness and his frustration existing in perfect, unconflicted harmony. He remembered things. Small, offhand comments I'd made weeks prior. I'd mentioned once, in passing, that I missed the taste of real, sun-warmed tomatoes from my grandmother's garden. The next time I came over, he had a small, struggling tomato plant in a pot waiting for me on the porch. "It's not your grandma's garden," he'd said, scuffing his boot on the ground. "But it's a start. We can nurse it back to health together." The gesture was so thoughtful, so utterly without expectation of thanks or reciprocation, that it left me breathless. It wasn't a grand romantic gesture. It was a quiet, attentive act of seeing me. One rainy Tuesday, we were in his cluttered, comfortable living room, surrounded by the gentle patter of rain on the roof. We were attempting to bake cookies, a disastrous endeavor that had resulted in more flour on us than in the bowl. Some terrible reality show was playing softly on the television in the background, a mind-numbing cacophony of drama and shouting. During a commercial break, one of those painfully earnest ads for a children's hospital came on. It showed parents holding their sick children, doctors working miracles, all set to a soaring emotional song. I was focused on trying to salvage the cookie dough, but I saw Ben go still out of the corner of my eye. I looked up. He was frozen, a dusting of flour on his cheek, his eyes fixed on the screen. His expression was open, utterly unguarded. As the ad reached its emotional peak, his eyes welled up. He didn't sob, didn't make a sound. He just let the tears well up and spill over, tracking through the flour on his face. He was completely absorbed in the story, in the raw humanity of it. The ad ended and he blinked, coming back to himself. He noticed me watching and offered a watery smile, swiping at his cheek with his sleeve, smearing the flour even more. "Sorry," he mumbled, not sounding sorry at all. The resilience of those kids, it just wrecks me. In that moment, something fundamental shifted inside me. The last of my defenses, the final, reinforced wall I'd built around my heart, simply dissolved. It wasn't taken down by a grand declaration or a dramatic act. It was washed away by the quiet, unashamed honesty of his tears. This was a man who wasn't afraid to feel. A man whose strength wasn't in his stoicism, but in his profound and open empathy. He was worthy not in spite of his quirks, but because of them. He was the realest, most solid thing I had ever encountered. And standing there in his flour-dusted kitchen, watching him cry over a television commercial, I felt a surge of something so powerful it stole my breath. It wasn't just attraction. It wasn't just gratitude. It was trust. A deep cellular trust that I had thought was extinct in me. He was a safe place to land. And for the first time since my world had ended, I wanted to fall. Our first official date was at a flea market. It wasn't a dinner at a loud, dimly lit restaurant where you have to perform over small plates. It wasn't a movie where you sit in silent, dark proximity, unsure of the rules. It was a sprawling, chaotic maze of other people's discarded histories, under the vast, open sky. It felt like the only place we could possibly go. He picked me up in his rusty truck, and Kevin the goat, apparently his default co-pilot, was in the passenger seat. Ben looked genuinely apologetic. He gives me the guilt trip if I leave him behind. "We can put him in the back with the blankets?" I just laughed and climbed into the middle seat, my leg pressed against the gear shift, the goat bleating a happy greeting from my other side. This was my life now. And I didn't hate it. The flea market was a sensory overload in the best possible way. The smell of candied nuts and old paper, the glare of the sun on chrome trinkets, the murmur of 1,000 simultaneous negotiations. We didn't have a mission. We just wandered, our shoulders brushing occasionally in the crowd. The rhythm was easy, natural. We'd drift apart to examine different tables. Him toward a pile of old tools, me toward a box of vintage linens, and then seamlessly find each other again. There was no pressure to hold hands, to define the moment. We were just two people, exploring. Then we found it. A battered cardboard box filled with vintage board games. The boxes were faded, the corners softened by time and use. We knelt on the dusty ground together, pulling out treasures. A 1970s edition of Scrabble with wooden tiles that felt like smooth river stones. A bizarre game about hotel tycoons from the 1960s. A trivia game where all the answers were pre-1985. We started making up our own rules for the games we didn't know, creating elaborate, silly backstories for the characters on the boxes. I found myself laughing, really laughing, the kind that comes from your stomach and leaves you breathless. It wasn't the performative laughter I'd used at Mark's work functions. This was unplanned, unstoppable, and entirely for my own benefit. We bought 3 of the most absurd games we could find for a total of $10. The entire drive home, we tried to invent a new game using the components from all 3, arguing playfully about the rules. No, if you land on go to jail, you have to answer a trivia question about disco, and if you get it wrong, you have to give one of your hotels to the goat, Ben declared, completely serious. Kevin bleated from the back as if in agreement. I protested through my laughter, and the argument continued all the way back to my house, the setting sun painting the interior of the truck, a warm gold. That became our perfect weekend. Not lavish getaways or expensive dinners, but this. The following Saturday, we attempted to bake an elaborate Black Forest cake from scratch. The kitchen looked like a bomb site of chocolate and cherry splatter. The cake layers were lopsided, the whipped cream frosting deflated, and we'd somehow managed to get more chocolate on ourselves than in the dish. We sat on my living room floor, surrounded by the wreckage, eating gigantic, messy slices straight from the pan with our hands. It was, without a doubt, the most delicious thing I had ever tasted. Another weekend, we built an elaborate blanket fort in my living room, draping every sheet and quilt I owned over furniture, creating a cavern of soft light and fabric. We crawled inside with a laptop and spent hours arguing over what to stream, finally settling on a terrible monster movie that was so bad it became brilliant. We heckled the screen, threw popcorn at the bad sea guy, and cheered when the monster finally ate the unlikable protagonist. Lying there in the dim fort, our shoulders touching, the sound of his laughter mixing with mine, I felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost dizzying. This was it. This was the traditional happiness I'd thought I'd lost. But it wasn't the same. It was better. It wasn't built on a picture-perfect image of what a relationship should be. It was built on a foundation of inside jokes, failed cakes, and a shared love for terrible movies. It was built on us. It was a Tuesday evening, the least significant day of the week, that the final piece clicked into place. We were at his place, washing dishes after a simple dinner. The radio was playing some old soft rock song. He was scrubbing a pot, and I was drying, and there was a comfortable silence between us. I looked at him, really looked at him, at the way his brow furrowed in concentration over a stubborn piece of baked-on food, at the way he hummed slightly off-key to the radio. This man who cried at commercials and argued with geese and remembered that I liked sun-warmed tomatoes. This was my new normal. Not a desperate escape from my old life, but a conscious, daily choice. The thought was so clear, so calm. My biggest fear had been being alone. But now I wasn't choosing him out of fear of that loneliness. I was choosing him because he made my weird, post-heartbreak life, with its pottery shards and flat tires and anxious goats, a million times more fun. He made it real. He made it mine. I put down the dish towel. He turned to look at me, a question in his eyes. I didn't say anything. I just smiled and took the pot from his hands. The upgrade wasn't a better man. It was a better me, living a better, truer life. And he was the one I wanted to build it with. The blanket fort had become a permanent installation in my living room. We'd perfected its architecture, adding fairy lights and more pillows, and it had become our default headquarters for everything from movie marathons to intense, whispered conversations over mugs of tea. It was in that soft, fabric-diffused light that the last vestiges of my old life finally fell away. I told him everything, not just the sanitized version, the emojis, the picnic, the flat tire, but the ugly, gut-wrenching details. The sleepless nights talking to the toaster, the visceral need to burn his things, the crushing loneliness of lying next to a man who had become a stranger. The words spilled out of me like a poison I'd been carrying for months, and Ben just listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes. He just held my hand, his thumb making slow, steady circles on my skin, an anchor in the storm of my confession. When I finished, breathless and raw, he was quiet for a long moment. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. I braced myself for pity, or worse, for the gentle withdrawal that might come from realizing the sheer amount of baggage I was dragging behind me. Instead, he said, "Thank you for telling me." His voice was low and steady. "For trusting me with that." He didn't tell me I was strong. He didn't tell me it would all be okay. He simply saw the damage, acknowledged its weight, and made it clear he wasn't afraid of it. In that moment, he wasn't just accepting me, he was accepting every broken piece of my history, the shards I'd painstakingly glued back together with gold. He was seeing the whole map of my fractures and tracing them with a reverence that left me breathless. A few days later, he asked if I wanted to go stargazing. He knew a spot, he said, up on a hill away from the city lights. It felt like a step, a date, but more than that, a silent, shared space under the infinite sky. We drove up in his truck, a thermos of hot chocolate between us, Kevin happily relegated to the back with a new chew toy. The spot was perfect. A high ridge overlooking sleeping fields, the sky above us a vast black velvet canvas dusted with diamonds. We spread an old quilt in the bed of the truck and lay on our backs, shoulders touching, watching the cosmos slowly wheel above us. The air was cold and clean, and our breath plumed in the air like ghosts. We didn't talk much. There was no need. The silence between us was no longer something to be filled. It was its own kind of conversation. It was a comfortable, living silence, punctuated only by the distant cry of a coyote and the rustle of the dry grass in the breeze. I felt small, but not insignificant. I felt connected to the earth, to the universe, to the man lying quietly beside me. My hand was resting on the rough canvas of the truck bed, and after a while his fingers found mine, lacing through them. His hand was warm and solid, a point of heat in the cool night. It wasn't a question or a demand. It was just a connection. A fact. I thought about Mark then, for the first time in days. Not with pain or anger, but with a strange, distant curiosity, like remembering a character from a book I'd read long ago. Our relationship had been so loud. It was filled with grand gestures, dramatic fights, and passionate reconciliations. It was a symphony played at maximum volume, and I hadn't realized how exhausting it was until I was lying in this profound, peaceful quiet. What I had with Ben wasn't a symphony. It was the quiet, steady hum of the earth itself. It was the patient, silent growth of a tree. It was real in a way that nothing in my previous life had ever been. The climax wasn't a dramatic declaration under the stars. It wasn't a kiss. It was a realization that settled over me as gently as the moonlight. It was the understanding that my biggest fear had been being alone, but now, lying in this perfect, shared silence, I knew I was no longer making a choice out of that fear. I wasn't choosing Ben because I was afraid of being by myself. I was choosing him because with him I was never truly alone, even in the quiet. He made my world. My weird, broken, beautifully mended world, not just tolerable, but vibrant and full of light. The upgrade wasn't him. It was the life I was building, and he was the one I wanted to build it with. One quiet, honest moment at a time. I turned my head on the quilt to look at him. He was already looking at me, his eyes reflecting the starlight. He didn't smile, he just waited, his gaze steady and sure. He was giving me the space to choose without pressure, without expectation. I squeezed his hand, a silent answer to a question that had never needed to be asked aloud. We turned our faces back to the sky, to the endless, silent dance of the stars, two small souls under the immense sky, choosing each other, moment by quiet moment. The final box from Mark sat by the front door, a plain, brown cardboard cube that held the last physical remnants of a life that no longer existed. He'd dropped it off earlier, a hurried, awkward exchange on the porch that lasted less than 30 seconds. There was no anger left in me, no sharp edges of pain. Looking at him felt like looking at a photograph of someone I'd known a long time ago. The features were familiar, but the emotional connection had been severed. The box contained things I'd forgotten I'd even owned. A university sweatshirt, a few paperbacks, a small jewelry box filled with costume jewelry from my 20s. It was a time capsule from a woman I barely recognized. I didn't open it right away. I left it there by the door and went about my day. I watered my cactus. I answered emails for Kintsugi Care, a client wanting to know if I could repair a beloved ceramic Christmas ornament. I swept the kitchen floor. The box was just an object. It had no power over me anymore. Later that afternoon, Ben came over. He saw the box, glanced at me with a silent question in his eyes. I just nodded, and he carried it into the living room without a word, setting it down in the middle of the floor amidst our half-dismantled blanket fort. We were taking it down today. Not because we were done with forts, but because we were building something new. We sat cross-legged on the floor, facing the box. "You sure?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Yeah," I said, and I meant it. "It's just stuff." I slit the tape with a key. The smell that wafted out was a punch to the gut old paper, faint perfume and the unmistakable scent of Mark's old apartment. It was the smell of the past. Ben didn't say anything. He just rested a hand on my knee, a steady, warm pressure that kept me anchored in the present. I started pulling things out. The sweatshirt went into a donate pile. The paperbacks into a keep pile. I still loved those stories, and they were mine, not his. And then, the jewelry box. I opened it. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, was a cheap silver locket on a broken chain. I hadn't seen it in years. I clicked it open. Inside was a tiny, faded picture of me and Mark, taken at a county fair in our first year together. We were squeezed into a photo booth, faces pressed together, laughing. We looked impossibly young, our eyes bright with a future we thought was guaranteed. I stared at it for a long time. I expected a pang of sadness, a flicker of regret, but all I felt was a distant, quiet pity for those two kids who had no idea what was coming. They were so sure of their happiness. I closed the locket. The clasp was broken, the chain snapped. For a second, I saw it not as a discarded piece of junk, but as a piece of kintsugi waiting to happen. A broken thing, ready to be made new with a seam of gold. "Can I?" Ben asked softly, nodding toward the locket. I handed it to him. He examined it with a practiced eye, turning it over in his rough, capable hands. "The chain's an easy fix," he murmured. "And the clasp. I think I have something that would work in my toolbox. A small gold-colored one. It wouldn't be a perfect match, but..." He trailed off, looking at me, letting me make the choice. I could throw it back in the box, donate it, let it become part of someone else's story. Or I could reclaim it. I could mend it and change its meaning entirely. It wouldn't be a locket about Mark and Emma anymore. It would be a locket about survival, about the woman who had been broken and had put herself back together, stronger and more beautiful for having been fractured. "Yes," I said, my voice clear. "Please, fix it." He smiled, a small, understanding smile, and pocketed the locket. He didn't make a big deal of it. It was just another broken thing he could help make whole. We finished sorting the box. The donate pile was large. The keep pile was small. It felt less like cleaning out a closet and more like a final, gentle exhale. That evening, we built a new fort. But this one was different. We built it in the backyard, stringing up lights between two trees and draping blankets over a clothesline. We lit a small fire in a pit, and the smell of wood smoke chased away the last ghost of that old apartment smell. We were roasting marshmallows when Ben handed me the locket. He'd fixed it. The broken chain was replaced with a simple, sturdy one, and the new clasp was indeed a small, gold-colored hook. It was perfect. It was better than new. I held it in my palm, the metal warm from his pocket. I didn't put our picture back in. It was empty, a blank slate. I looked at Ben across the fire, his face glowing in the flickering light. He was telling a story about Kevin trying to help him fix a fence, his hands moving animatedly. This was my life now. This quiet, sturdy, hilarious man. This backyard. This fire. This sense of peace that was so deep it felt like it had roots. The locket wasn't about the past anymore. It was about the future. My future. One I was building on my own terms, with my own two hands, with gold-filled cracks and a stronger foundation. I closed my fist around the locket, feeling the solid, sure weight of it. The past was a box I had finally closed. The present was a fire under a starlit sky. And the future? The future was wide open, and it was finally, completely, mine.